April 3rd, 1944, 20,000 feet above Leipzig. The sky was crystal blue, but not calm. Not for the men inside the German cockpits who flew with their eyes locked on the horizon and fingers twitching on the trigger. The oxygen masks pressed against their faces left just enough space to feel the sweat building behind the goggles. They had flown this route before, many times. They had escorted, intercepted, returned. Some had even carved kill counts into their dashboards. But today was different. There was a sound in the air, faint at first, like a whisper moving faster than the wind. Not the familiar growl of a B-17, not the thunder of flak. This was sharp, high-pitched, almost surgical. Some pilots mistook it for interference in their radios. Others went silent altogether. It was not what they heard that terrified them. It was what they recognized. A new predator was above them. The Germans had dominated the skies for years. With their Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, they had controlled the tempo of the air war over Europe. Speed, climb, firepower. They had every advantage. And when the Americans first arrived with their twin-tail Lightnings and overweight Thunderbolts, they mocked them, called them milk bottles with wings. Big, clumsy, easy kills. But the sound they heard now was not coming from a milk bottle. It was the high whine of a Rolls Royce Merlin engine, pushed to its limit at altitude. What made it terrifying was not just its speed or its tone. It was the fact that it came from above, unseen, and then suddenly from behind. Always behind. Many Luftwaffe pilots described the feeling as being hunted, not challenged, not engaged. Hunted, like a fox caught by a silent hawk. By the time they turned, it was too late. The tracers had already painted the sky. Still, in that moment above Leipzig, some of them clung to instinct. They scanned the blue for shapes, for movement, for anything that gave away the position of this ghost. But the ghost had changed the rules of the game. It did not announce itself. It did not play fair, and most cruelly, it waited. This was psychological warfare in its purest form. Pilots trained to fight with bravado now gripped their controls in silence. No chatter, no calls for support, just breath. And then, the moment they feared arrived. A formation of Mustangs broke through the cloud line above. Sleek, fast, metallic streaks of vengeance. What followed was not a dogfight. It was not a contest. It was execution. The German radio frequencies that once buzzed with confidence were now empty. Not because no one was there, but because no one dared to speak. There is something about fear that shuts down the voice, something about recognizing your own extinction that turns you inward. And in that silence, the Mustangs spoke for them. Their engines howled like judgment. Their guns hammered like thunder from the heavens. For the men in those cockpits, survival became instinct, not strategy. Brake left, dive, climb. It did not matter. The new rules were written in American steel. Speed, altitude, range, and overwhelming firepower, all packed into a machine that looked light but hit like a hammer. And this was only the beginning. What makes this moment so haunting is how fast everything changed. 1 year earlier, the Americans could barely reach the German border. Now, their fighters flew deep into the heart of the Reich. And they did not come alone. They escorted bombers in daylight, something even the British had abandoned. They stayed through the flak fields. They fought over Berlin. They landed and refueled and came back again and again, until there were no more targets left to strike. But on April 3rd, above Leipzig, none of that mattered to the men in the sky. All that mattered was the sound, that high-pitched note that came before the guns, a sound they would never forget, because it was not just the noise of a machine. It was the signal that the sky had changed hands. Some American pilots described the way German planes began to behave after the Mustangs arrived. They stopped climbing. They stayed low. They ran. They rarely turned to fight unless outnumbering their enemy. For a Luftwaffe ace, once the hunter, now to avoid combat, it was humiliation written in smoke trails. And for the Americans flying above them, many just kids with southern accents and crew cuts, there was no celebration, no cheers in the cockpit. The silence was mutual, because they knew what it meant to kill a man in the sky. They saw the black smoke spiraling down. They knew what it meant. This is not a tale of glory. It is a tale of silence, The silence of fear, the silence of recognition, and the silence that came when the old empire of the air collapsed. Not with fire, but with the sound of something sharp and new slicing through the cold. If you felt the weight of this moment, leave your thoughts below. We want to hear your take on this forgotten chapter of history. And if this kind of story moves you the way it moves us, subscribe now for more untold moments from the war that changed the world. It started as a rushed request. In 1940, the British Air Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with a question that would unknowingly change the face of the air war over Europe. Could they build Curtiss P-40s under license for the Royal Air Force? The Americans hesitated. Instead of copying an outdated design, they offered something else, a new fighter, fast, agile, and designed from scratch in just 117 days. That plane would become the P-51 Mustang, but in its first version, the Mustang was underwhelming. It had range, it had style, but it lacked the one thing that turned fighters into legends: power. The early Mustangs were fitted with Allison engines, which performed decently at low altitude, but fell short where it mattered most: high-altitude combat. In the skies of Europe, where engagements often occurred above 20,000 feet, this limitation was fatal. The aircraft had the bones of a predator, but the lungs of a sprinter. It was fast at sea level and lethal in ground support, but in the stratosphere, it choked. Then came the turning point, a British experiment. Engineers at Rolls Royce had a theory. What if they took the Mustang, stripped out the Allison, and replaced it with their most powerful engine, the Merlin? It was the same engine that had already saved Britain once, powering the Spitfire and the Hurricane during the Battle of Britain. But when merged with the American airframe, something extraordinary happened. The numbers changed, the ceiling rose, the climb improved. The Mustang was reborn. With the Merlin 61 engine, and later the Packard-built version under license in America, the P-51B and P-51D became not just fast, they became dominant. It could reach speeds of over 700 kilometers per hour. It could climb to 41,000 feet, and more importantly, it could now escort bombers deep into enemy territory without having to turn back. This combination of elegance and lethality turned the Mustang into a machine that seemed to defy physics. It had a laminar flow wing designed to reduce drag and increase efficiency. That meant longer range with less fuel. It carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, capable of delivering devastating streams of fire with remarkable stability. And thanks to its bubble canopy and later variants, the pilot had unmatched visibility. It was the hunter's ideal. But what truly made the Mustang terrifying was not just its engineering, it was what it represented. For years, the Luftwaffe had counted on one thing to keep the Reich safe: distance. As long as the Allied fighters could not reach central Germany, bombers would be vulnerable. Fighter escorts would turn back halfway, leaving the B-17s and B-24s to face the storm alone. And that is where the German fighters fed. They struck in packs. They destroyed formations. They filled the sky with fire and debris. Then the Mustang came. Suddenly, the equation changed. Mustangs could fly all the way to Berlin. They could sweep the skies before the bombers arrived. They could stay with them through the worst of it. And they could follow German fighters home. There was no more safe distance, no more sanctuary. Even more impressively, the P-51 did all this while being cheaper and easier to produce than its contemporaries. It cost just $50,000 to build, far less than the P-47, Thunderbolt, or the twin-engine P-38 Lightning. It was lighter, required less maintenance, and could operate from rougher airfields. The United States did not just build a better fighter, they built it by the thousands. Pilots fell in love with it almost immediately. One American ace described it as the plane that could do everything: dogfight, escort, dive, climb, run. It gave them the tools to fight and the confidence to win. But love does not explain fear. And for the Luftwaffe, the P-51 inspired exactly that. Because it was fast enough to catch you, agile enough to outturn you, and armed enough to kill you before you even knew it was there. It blended into the sky and waited. Many German pilots reported being shot down without ever seeing their attacker. The Mustang was not just a plane. It was a presence, a shadow. And then there was the sound. The Rolls Royce Merlin did not growl like a radial engine. It shrieked, it howled. Its high-pitched whine could cut through flak adrenaline. It was the last sound many would hear. And once you had heard it, you never forgot it. Pilots could tell a Mustang from miles away, not by sight, but by tone. In many Luftwaffe memoirs, that sound is described with the same weight as a gunshot, a sonic warning, a hunter's call. By early 1944, squadrons of P-51s were operating daily over occupied Europe. They were painted in silver, with black and white invasion stripes, or olive drab depending on the season. But their real color was distance. They represented reach, a hand that could strike anywhere, at any altitude, at any time. There is one documented case of a Mustang diving from 30,000 feet onto a German airfield during refueling operations. It hit one aircraft on the ground, looped away, and disappeared. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds. No warning, no response, just silence. And then, fire. That is what the Mustang brought. The end of predictability. In the past, the enemy could prepare, could anticipate, but now they simply waited and hoped the next sound they heard was not the shriek of a Merlin closing in from behind. If this part of the story moved you in any way, share your thoughts in the comments below. Each voice helps keep these moments alive. And if you want more stories that bring history back to life with the sound and soul it deserves, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. They were trained to speak with precision. German fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe operated in a world of calculated timing and ruthless efficiency. Their radios were lifelines. Command channels buzzed with sharp orders, target calls, fuel reports, and enemy sightings. It was through these frequencies that squadrons moved as one, that missions unfolded with clockwork execution. But now, in the spring of 1944, something had changed. The silence was not ordered. It was not protocol. It was fear. When the P-51 Mustang began appearing regularly in the skies over Germany, something unexpected began to happen. Pilots who once barked commands with confidence began to hesitate. Chatter faded. Reports went missing. Entire formations would fly into contact zones in complete radio silence, not by instruction, but by instinct. Something about that new sound in the sky, the high-pitched scream of the Merlin engine, froze the voice in their throats. It is a strange thing how fear can take away language. These were not rookies. Many were veterans of the Battle of Britain, of the WWII Eastern Front, of the Mediterranean. They had faced odds, survived flame, outmaneuvered enemies. Yet when the Mustang arrived, it brought a different kind of pressure. Not the chaos of flak, not the urgency of a turning fight, but the creeping certainty that someone was already behind you, watching, waiting. The Mustang did not need to fight to win. Its presence alone altered the rhythm of war. Interviews with surviving Luftwaffe pilots decades later often circle back to the same moment. Just before engagement, when they heard the whine in the distance. A few described fumbling their oxygen masks. Others admitted to lowering their throttles slightly, hoping to blend into formation. And many recalled reaching for the radio, only to stop. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they feared speaking might make them the next target. Voice reveals position. Position invites fire. In the age of analog warfare, every sound had weight. An open channel could mean salvation or death. The Americans were listening, the British were triangulating, and the Mustang pilots, trained to read and react in split seconds, used that silence against their enemy. It became a strange irony. The Luftwaffe, once feared for its brutal coordination and seamless radio discipline, was now being undone by its own silence. Leaders in Berlin noticed it. Interception data from RAFY stations documented entire German formations flying mute. American bomber crews even noted it in their mission logs. There were fewer voice contacts, fewer early warnings, just sudden strikes, or more often, sudden retreats. Some historians argue this radio silence was merely a tactical shift, an adaptation. But veterans tell a different story. This was not strategy. This was hesitation born from experience. Pilots had learned the hard way that speaking up could draw attention. And when the Mustang was overhead, attention meant death. Imagine being in that cockpit. Altitude 25,000. Oxygen thin. Vision narrowed through a fogged canopy. You hear something. A faint whine. You scan the sky. Nothing. You key the mic. Enemy high. 12 o'clock. And in that second, your formation lights up. Tracers rip through aluminum. Canopies explode. You never see who fired. You just know it started when you spoke. That pattern repeated across dozens of engagements. Not always, but enough. One German ace, credited with over 50 kills, once wrote in his post-war diary that the most terrifying moment of his career was not being outnumbered, hearing a single Mustang engine passing overhead while his radio hissed in his ear. He did not call for backup. He did not shout a warning. He simply dropped into a dive and ran. And he lived. Others were not so lucky. Some stayed in formation, believing silence would protect them. Some turned to fight and never returned. And some never saw the Mustang at all. There is power in not being seen. And the Mustang, with its superior altitude performance, often struck from the sun, from above, from angles the Luftwaffe had not yet adapted to. Its pilots understood that fear multiplied in isolation. If they could break a squadron's voice, they could break its will. This is where psychological warfare blends into engineering. The P-51 was more than a machine of metal and fuel. It was a statement that the skies were no longer theirs, that the Reich could be reached, that there was nowhere left to hide. And the most painful proof of that was the silence. It crept into briefings, into mission planning, into the very way German squadrons approached battle. Instructors began to caution cadets about speaking too freely on comms. Veteran pilots briefed rookies not just on maneuvers, but on how to survive being stalked. They warned them not to respond too quickly, not to challenge unless absolutely sure, not to assume that the Mustang was gone just because the sky looked clear. This fear evolved into respect, and that respect, over time, became surrender. Not of territory, not of politics, but of voice. The very thing that once gave the Luftwaffe its edge. Years later, when asked about the turning point in the air war, many German veterans did not speak of D-Day or the bombing of Dresden. They spoke of the first time they flew a mission without saying a word, the first time the sky felt owned by someone else, the first time they realized they were no longer hunters, because when a man stops talking, it is not just silence, it is resignation. And in those quiet frequencies, history was being rewritten one breath at a time. If this story struck a chord with you, let us know what part hit hardest in the comments. Every memory we share keeps the voices of the past alive. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told in all their depth and complexity, subscribe and help us bring more forgotten chapters back into the light. By the beginning of 1944, the Luftwaffe still believed it held the upper hand in the skies over Europe. After all, their interceptors were fast, experienced, and backed by years of dominance in aerial warfare. German fighter aces, many with dozens of confirmed kills, flew with the confidence of those who had shaped the very doctrine of modern air combat. Their radar stations tracked enemy formations with precision. Their ground crews operated like machines. Their aircraft, the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, were known and feared. But what they did not see, at least not right away, was that the very nature of the war had shifted. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang was not just a tactical improvement, it was a strategic revolution. Before its deployment, American bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were being sent deep into enemy territory with limited or no fighter escort. These missions, known as daylight strategic bombing, aimed to cripple German industry, transportation, and morale. But they came at an unspeakable cost. Bomber crews called it the combat box, a defensive formation of aircraft meant to cover each other with overlapping fields of fire. It was theory turned into ritual, guns pointing in every direction, tight flying in turbulence, hours of tension, and then the inevitable ambush. When the escort fighters reached their limit and turned back, that was the moment the Luftwaffe waited for. German fighters would climb in mass formations from prepared airfields, often directed by ground controllers. They would swarm the bombers like wolves circling a herd. The air would fill with cannon shells and machine gun tracers. Engines exploded, wings sheared off, parachutes opened late or not at all. The sky became a killing field. One mission in October 1943 saw 291 B-17s fly to Schweinfurt. 60 never returned. Hundreds of crew members were lost in a single day, and the same brutal pattern repeated week after week. It was unsustainable. Some military planners began to question the IBEB entire strategy. How could you break the industrial spine of Germany if your own bombers were being slaughtered on the way there? Then, quietly and almost without warning, the pattern began to shift. Mustangs. They began appearing on the flanks, then in the rear, then high above the formations, first in small numbers, then in squadrons. By the spring of 1944, the P-51 was there from the start of the mission to its end. It flew from airstrips in England and could go the distance all the way to Berlin and back. This was more than an escort. It was a turning of the tide. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe found itself in unfamiliar territory. They were used to being the hunters, but now they were being intercepted before reaching the bombers. Their attacks were disrupted, their formations broken apart before they could even engage. For the first time in the war, German pilots were the ones looking over their shoulders, and it was not just about presence, it was about performance. The Mustang had the speed to chase down even the fastest German interceptors. It had the agility to turn inside them, and it had the firepower to kill them quickly. One P-51 pilot described it like this: "We were no longer playing defense. We were turning the sky into a trap." This change had massive ripple effects. German pilot losses began to climb. Training programs could not keep up. New recruits were being sent into combat with barely 100 hours of flight experience, facing American pilots with twice that time and a better aircraft. The psychological impact was devastating. Morale plummeted. Radio traffic became disorganized. Commanders were forced to reorganize squadrons in the middle of campaigns, and in many cases, German fighters simply failed to show up. The Mustang had done something extraordinary. It had not just balanced the equation, it had rewritten it. And this new equation favored the side with more fuel, more steel, more factories, more pilots, more everything. The Americans were not just building machines, they were building momentum. And momentum in war is everything. Even Hitler, obsessed with wonder weapons and last stands, began to notice the shift. Reports on fighter losses grew more urgent. Demands for new jet aircraft like the Me-262 became louder, but it was already too late. Because the Mustang had exposed the truth. Air superiority is not about killing the enemy. It is about denying them space, denying them time, denying them the confidence to act. And slowly, with every mission, the Luftwaffe lost its space, its time, its confidence. The sky had changed owners. And while the ground war still raged, and the Eastern Front bled daily, up in the clouds, the war was already being decided by fuel tanks and wingtips, by oil pressure and oxygen flow, by young men in silver planes flying higher, faster, and farther than anyone thought possible. In that world, altitude was safety, speed was life, and silence was death. If this chapter gave you something to think about, or helped you see the air war in a new light, leave your reflections below. We read every comment, and if you believe history should be remembered in full color, with the weight it deserves, join our mission by subscribing today. Long before a pilot saw the P-51 in the sky, they heard it. At first, it was a distant whine, almost like a whisper tucked into the wind. Thin, sharp, unnatural. Not the heavy hum of a B-17 formation, not the mechanical bark of German engines. It was higher-pitched, urgent, and eerie. Those who survived their first encounter described it as something that reached into your spine and pressed against your instincts. You could not always tell where it was coming from, but the moment it pierced the air, you knew. The Mustang was near. It was not just sound, it was signal, and it carried meaning far beyond what any radar or command post could deliver. The Rolls Royce Merlin engine, licensed and mass-produced by Packard in the United States, had a distinctive acoustic profile. Its 12 cylinders operated with a hum that evolved into a scream at altitude. Engineers optimized it for performance, not for noise control. And what came out of that engine was nothing short of psychological warfare. To the bomber crews, that sound meant salvation. They could hear it even before the P-51s came into view. Above the rumble of 4 massive engines and the occasional rattle of defensive guns, the Mustang's arrival was unmistakable. Crewmen would later say that it was like hearing cavalry arrive, not just reinforcement, but revenge. One gunner wrote in a letter, "When we heard that whine, we knew we had a chance. It was the sound of someone watching our backs." But for the Luftwaffe, the same sound meant something else entirely. It was a countdown, a harbinger. The last thing many of them heard before a canopy exploded or a wing vanished into smoke. The P-51 was fast and often struck from above, but the engine betrayed just enough of its presence to generate panic. The fear it inspired was so intense that German pilots began to change behavior simply based on that noise. Break formations, drop altitude, dive without visual contact. It broke the rhythm of engagement. In the villages and towns below, civilians too learned the difference. German aircraft tended to produce a deeper, guttural tone. Allied fighters, with their supercharged Merlins, screamed. The sounds echoed through alleyways and rattled windows. Children were taught to recognize them. Mothers listened for them before running to shelters. Farmers paused midfield to listen. And in that split second, they knew whether they were witnessing defense or invasion. Sound became the invisible front line. One of the most haunting examples came from a German mechanic stationed near Hanover. In his post-war memoir, he described a moment when he heard a single Mustang engine overhead while working on a damaged Focke-Wulf. He froze. No alarms. No warning. Just that whistle slicing through the clouds. Seconds later, the base erupted in fire. The Mustang had dropped from 25,000 feet in a steep dive, strafed 2 grounded aircraft, and disappeared before flak crews could react. He survived, but he never forgot the sound. Even the American pilots acknowledged it. Some of them loved it, some feared it, many respected it. That scream was not just intimidation, it was identity. It meant that they were flying the best, that they were the spearhead. One Mustang pilot reportedly said, "If you can hear me, I am already behind you." It was more than bravado. It was fact. Aircraft of the era did not have stealth, but they had signatures: visual, radar, and acoustic. The Mustang's signature was terrifyingly unique. Other fighters could be mistaken at a distance. The Lightning, with its twin booms. The Thunderbolt, with its radial roar. But the Mustang was instantly recognizable, even to those with no experience in aviation. Its sound preceded its kill, and that sound had a rhythm. A crescendo as it accelerated into a dive, a tightening as it leveled off behind a target. Then the burst of 650 caliber machine guns, often lasting only 2 seconds, enough to tear through wings and cockpits alike. Then silence again, just a few seconds, but they etched themselves into memory. In airfields across occupied Europe, Luftwaffe ground crews began reporting higher levels of tension. Pilots were not just returning with bullet holes. They were returning with wide eyes and shaking hands. They spoke less, slept worse. Officers noted increased fatigue. The Mustang was not winning dogfights. It was unraveling the enemy's nerves before the fight even started. And this sonic dominance extended beyond pilots and ground crew. It infected the very way the enemy thought about the air war. German propaganda began to avoid discussing Allied fighters. Reports became vague. Losses were buried behind phrases like enemy activity or intense aerial presence. Because even in official language, the sound of the Mustang did not need translation. It was no longer just a tool of war. It was a legend with a soundtrack. In popular culture, decades after the war, filmmakers and historians still struggle to recreate that sound authentically. Simulators try to capture it. Documentaries overlay it for emotional weight. And veterans, now old and quiet, still recognize it within seconds. That is the true legacy of the Mustang's voice. It lives not just in museums or wreckage, but in the space between silence and memory, in the air itself. If you could almost hear it just now, that echo in your mind, Share your thoughts with us in the comments. These are not just facts, they are echoes. And if you want to keep hearing them with every new story we tell, subscribe and stay with us as we continue bringing the forgotten back into focus. The sky over Europe in 1944 was no longer the chaotic battlefield of 2 years earlier, had transformed into a place of calculated precision, of sudden strikes and invisible enemies. And for the men who flew in that space, survival was not a matter of skill alone. It was a matter of instinct, timing, and sometimes pure luck. But when the P-51 Mustang entered that sky, it redefined what survival looked like, not just for those flying it, but for those trying to escape it. There are moments in war that go beyond strategy, moments that imprint themselves so deeply into a person's memory that they resurface even decades later, not as facts, but as feelings. The sudden drop in air pressure, the scream of a Merlin engine diving from above, the flicker of tracers sweeping across your wing. These were the memories that stuck with the Luftwaffe pilots who lived to tell the tale. And they all began the same way, with silence, followed by speed. One German pilot, interviewed in the late 1980s, recalled a mission over northern France. His squadron had just taken off. Clear weather, good altitude. He never saw the Mustang. He only heard the wind change. A split second later, his wingman vanished in a burst of flame. By the time he turned to react, the American was already gone. He described it not as a fight, but as an execution. This was not uncommon. Mustang pilots were trained for this kind of warfare. Their aircraft had the range and fuel efficiency to remain airborne long after most enemy planes had landed. They would linger, circle, wait, and when a vulnerable target exposed itself, a lone fighter, a damaged bomber, or even aircraft taxiing on the runway, they struck with terrifying precision. It was a tactic that became known unofficially as silent hunting. The Mustang was fast enough to approach from above, nearly undetected, and then drop into a high-speed dive before the enemy had time to react. German pilots began flying with the understanding that they might already be targeted, that the enemy might already be above them, hidden by the sun or a thin layer of cloud. Paranoia became a survival tool. But for the Mustang pilots, there was no arrogance in the kill. Many of them were just 20 years old, farm boys from Nebraska, mechanics from Chicago, sons of immigrants. They did not see themselves as predators. They saw themselves as protectors. Their job was to shield the bombers, to get their crews home. Every fighter they took out meant fewer bullets fired at the men in the flying fortresses, and yet the power they wielded was absolute. A Mustang's 650 caliber Browning machine guns could shred metal in seconds. A well-aimed burst could tear through wings, rip open fuel tanks, and ignite engines. Sometimes it only took 2 seconds of fire to destroy a plane completely. There are recorded instances of Mustang pilots engaging 3 or more aircraft in a single pass, downing multiple enemies before the radio had time to register the first kill. But it was not just in the air. The Mustang began to appear in places the Germans never expected, strafing airfields, attacking trains, harassing convoys. Its range allowed it to reach deep into enemy territory, sometimes hours ahead of the main bomber force. It became the first sound of war on the German horizon, a reminder that the enemy was not just coming, he was already here. Some Luftwaffe survivors described their first experience with the Mustang as a turning point in their understanding of the war, not because of what the aircraft could do, but because of what it implied. That Germany no longer controlled its own airspace, that American machines could now go wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and no one could stop them. One veteran, who flew over Berlin in early 1945, said he no longer checked his 6 o'clock visually. He just assumed the Mustang was there. He changed altitude every few minutes. He adjusted throttle constantly. He knew that if he flew straight and level for too long, he would not fly again. This constant pressure bled into the culture of the Luftwaffe. Flight instructors began teaching defensive flying before offensive maneuvers. The art of evasion replaced the art of the kill. Training time was shortened. Cadets were told that if they encountered a Mustang, their best option was to run. Not because they were cowards, but because the plane simply outclassed them. Even the elite felt it. Luftwaffe aces, many with over 100 kills, began avoiding certain sectors of the sky. They knew the risk. They knew that one Mustang, flown by a determined pilot, would end a career in a flash. Some began flying in pairs, not for offense, but for defense, to watch each other's backs, to shout a warning in the last second. But the Mustang did not always give warning. Its approach was often invisible. Its kill was almost always final, and its retreat was immediate. No lingering, no taunting, just the echo of gunfire and the drifting smoke trail of another plane lost. Stories like these spread quickly, through flight, schools, through squadrons, through cities. In the barracks, new recruits whispered about the Mustang the way sailors spoke of storms, not as myth, but as inevitability. Something to fear, something to endure, but never, ever to underestimate. And this fear was not manufactured by propaganda. It was born from experience, reinforced every day, every mission. Every time a squadron returned with one plane missing, no one needed to ask. They already knew the answer. Mustang. If this story gave you a glimpse into the human side of this machine, tell us what part stayed with you most in the comments. Your thoughts help keep the memories alive. And if you believe these forgotten moments deserve to be felt, not just studied, subscribe and stay connected to history, told through those who lived it. The idea of long-range air power was once a fantasy, a theory in war rooms and chalkboard equations. Before 1944, air warfare in Europe followed invisible boundaries dictated by fuel tanks and time. Fighters could only protect bombers for a few hundred miles. Missions into the heart of Germany meant letting the bombers go alone, unguarded, through skies infested with flak and veteran Luftwaffe interceptors. It was a sacrifice accepted as necessary. Losses were expected. Bodies would be buried. Planes would burn. But the objective would be struck if the men could hold steady long enough to reach it. Then, almost overnight, the battlefield expanded. With the arrival of the P-51 Mustang and its external drop tanks, the rules changed. Range was no longer a limit. Suddenly, American fighters could escort bombers from the fields of England to the factories of Berlin and back. This was not a small detail. This was tectonic, a complete reshaping of how war could be waged from the air. On paper, the change looks like numbers. Fuel capacity increasing from 180 to over 400 gallons, with the addition of 2 underwing tanks. Maximum combat radius jumping from 450 to 1,600 kilometers. Mission time extending beyond 6 hours in the air. But on the ground and above it, this change translated into fear, confusion, and collapse for the Luftwaffe. For German commanders, the Allied front lines had always been distant. Fighter bases located in Britain meant limited reach. The further east the bombers flew, the safer German skies became. Targets deep inside the Reich had, until then, acted like fortresses guarded by distance. But the Mustang erased that distance. Its silver wings now pierced what was once considered unreachable. This shift began to show in mission reports. First, it was scattered sightings, a single P-51 over northern Germany, then squadrons appearing above Berlin. Soon, they were escorting all the way to targets like Merseburg, Leipzig, and even the oil fields in Romania. These were missions that once left bomber crews exposed for hours. Now, they had company, and more than that, they had cover. Colonel James Howard, a former Flying Tiger turned Mustang pilot, became a legend during one such mission over Oschersleben in January 1944. His bomber group came under attack by dozens of German fighters. Howard was the only P-51 pilot left in the vicinity, but instead of turning back, he stayed. Alone, he engaged wave after wave of enemy aircraft, protecting the bombers for nearly 30 minutes. His actions earned him the Medal of Honor, but more importantly, they sent a message. The Mustangs were here to stay. German pilots were not just fighting a new aircraft. They were fighting exhaustion, repeated losses, the disintegration of air superiority. As Allied bombers flew deeper, the Luftwaffe had to stretch itself thinner. Response times increased. Fuel shortages worsened. Training pipelines collapsed. Veteran pilots were replaced with teenagers who had barely mastered takeoff. And all the while, the Mustangs kept coming. They did not just protect the bombers. They hunted the hunters. With longer range, P-51s began flying ahead of bomber formations. These fighter sweeps targeted enemy airfields, fuel convoys, radar stations, and even trains. They disrupted the Luftwaffe before it could scramble. And when the enemy did get airborne, they often found themselves ambushed before reaching altitude. This shift forced the Germans to rethink everything. They moved air bases further east. They camouflaged runways. They limited flying time to conserve resources. But none of it was enough, because the Mustangs kept evolving. Faster, lighter, more reliable. By mid-1944, the impact was undeniable. German aircraft production remained high on paper, but actual sortie numbers were plummeting. The Luftwaffe could build planes, but not fly them. There were no safe corridors left. Every flight risked interception. Every mission drained what little fuel and morale remained. One of the most telling signs came from a German pilot's letter to his family. He wrote, "We hear them before we see them, and we see them only when it is already too late. They are everywhere. It is like they never land." This omnipresence broke more than wings. It broke routines. German crews began hiding aircraft during daylight. Training moved to nighttime. Even supply convoys changed routes to avoid Mustang patrol zones. And still, the losses continued. Because the Mustang did not just represent a better fighter. It represented the arrival of total air dominance. The very idea that a single machine could rewrite a nation's strategy was unthinkable before 1944. But that is exactly what happened. The P-51, with its drop tanks and relentless pace, forced the Reich onto the defensive. It robbed them of freedom in their own skies. It turned every cloud into a threat and every shadow into a question. And perhaps most crucially, it gave the Allies time. Time to bomb, time to regroup, time to push forward. Doolittle himself, the same man who once led the daring Tokyo raid in 1942, understood this better than anyone. The 8th
As
Air
commander
Force,
of
he changed tactics to allow Mustangs to leave bomber formations and seek out targets of opportunity. This aggressive policy, supported by the Mustang's endurance, bled the Luftwaffe dry, not just in aircraft, but in pilots, in leadership, in will. From that point on, the Germans could still fight, but they could not win. And in every village, every train yard, every forward base, they learned the same lesson. You could prepare for many things in war, but you could not prepare for the sound of a Mustang diving from the clouds. If this part of history helped you feel the war from a new perspective, take a second to share your reaction in the comments. Your voice helps us keep the past alive. And if stories like this matter to you, stories that echo long after the noise fades, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Victory in war is not always announced with noise. Sometimes it is declared in silence. Not the silence that comes from peace, but the kind that settles in when one side realizes the battle has already been lost. That silence, thick and undeniable, began to spread through the Luftwaffe like a fog in 1944. And it was not delivered by leaflets, or speeches, or even bombs. It came in the form of a sound they could not match, followed by a quiet they could no longer explain. The sound of a Mustang and the silence that followed it. In the early years of the war, German radio chatter was alive with precision and pride. Call signs snapped through the static. Orders came rapid fire. Squadrons moved in tight formation, confident in their air superiority. But as the months passed and the Mustangs grew more frequent, more aggressive, that chatter began to thin. Not from discipline, not from encryption, from fear. It began subtly. Shorter transmissions, slower reactions. Then, entire minutes without a word. One American radio operator monitoring Luftwaffe frequencies during a bomber escort mission over Bremen noted that the enemy went completely silent after the first Mustang squadron arrived. No intercept calls, no formation orders, just open air. They were still there. Radar confirmed that, but they were quiet. Invisible voices choosing not to be heard. Why? Because speaking became dangerous. The Luftwaffe learned that the Americans were not just listening, they were triangulating, picking up signals, using bursts of static to home in on fighters. And the Mustang pilots were already experts at turning whispers into targets. To speak was to be found. To be found was to be fired upon. So many stopped speaking altogether. But there was something deeper behind the silence, something psychological. Veteran German pilots, men who had flown over Poland, France, Britain, and Russia, began to admit, not publicly, but in letters and diaries, that they no longer felt ownership of the skies. The confidence was gone. The initiative had shifted. They were reacting, not acting, and they knew the Americans could sense it. One Luftwaffe squadron commander wrote privately, "It is no longer a question of who flies better. They own the air before we even get into it." The silence, then, became more than strategy. It became submission. Not in the formal sense. There was no surrender signed in the clouds. But in the air, behavior tells the truth before politics does. When pilots stop transmitting, when formations avoid contact, when flight logs list mission aborts due to sightings alone. That is surrender, and the Mustang enforced it relentlessly. With every deep strike into German airspace, the psychological line moved closer to Berlin. The once impenetrable capital began to feel exposed. The noise of sirens was replaced with the quiet dread of what might already be above. Citizens no longer ran for cover after hearing bombers. They ran at the sound of fighters. Because the P-51s did not just pass through. They circled, they returned, they lingered. This constant presence created what pilots called the unseen ceiling, a sense that above a certain altitude, something was always waiting. You might not see it, you might not hear it, but it was there, and it was watching. Even on days without engagement, Luftwaffe patrols returned early, fuel was rationed, morale was brittle, and over the intercom, commanders started hearing a phrase that rarely appeared in earlier years: no contact, returning to base. In a war defined by production, movement, and momentum, that phrase was devastating. It meant the fight was no longer worth the risk, that survival had become more valuable than resistance, and that is what the Mustang achieved. It made experienced fighters hesitate. It replaced their reflex to strike with a calculation they could not afford. There is a rare piece of audio recovered from a German base in late 1944. A radio operator, recording a training channel, captured an entire flight, returning without engagement. At the end of the tape, you can hear one pilot murmur in frustration, "They were there. I could feel it. But no one wanted to be the one to die today." That is what fear does when it settles into silence. And it was not limited to the front lines. Back at planning tables and command posts, the silence spoke louder than any damage report. Losses were up, interceptions were down. And in every corner of the Reich, the feeling spread. The air war was no longer winnable. American crews picked up on it too. Pilots began to notice fewer. Bombers took fewer hits. Mustang squadrons began flying with increased confidence, often venturing deeper than ever before, because they sensed the retreat even before it was official. The Germans were still flying, but they were no longer fighting with the same intensity. And the Mustang pilots understood exactly what that meant. It meant the battle had shifted from the sky to the mind. And once the mind is broken, even the most advanced aircraft cannot restore what has been lost. The war would still continue. More missions would be flown. More lives would be lost. But the tone had changed. The Luftwaffe was no longer the storm. It was the shadow of one. And the silence it left behind would echo long after the last Mustang touched down. If this story made you pause, if even a single sentence stayed with you, let us know below. We are building a community that listens to the voices of the past, even when those voices go quiet. Subscribe if you believe silence has a story to tell, and that story is worth remembering. By early 1945, the Mustang was no longer just a fighter. It was an icon, a symbol, a silhouette recognized across the entire European continent, not by sight alone, but by everything it carried with it: the sound, the fear, the reach, and the message. A machine that did not just change battles, but altered how people saw the sky. To the Allied bomber crews, it was the Guardian, the silver streak that flew alongside them through flak storms and fireballs, the last line of defense between survival and the long fall through burning air. Veterans who flew in B-17s or B-24s often described how the entire mood inside the fuselage shifted the moment a Mustang came into view, a relief that washed through metal and flesh alike. They were not alone, and that meant they might live. To the Mustang pilots themselves, the aircraft was more than a tool. It was an extension of instinct, a companion that answered when they pushed it, stayed silent when they needed focus, and performed when their lives hung by threads. These were not just dogfighters. They were young men trusted with precision tools of terrifying capability. Many flew dozens of missions, sometimes over 8 hours long, across snow-filled skies and flak-torn altitudes, guided by nothing but training, instinct, and the low hum of the Merlin engine beneath their boots. To the Germans, it was something else entirely. The Mustang had become a phantom, an ever-present shadow in the WWII skies. It no longer needed to fight to win. Its very existence reshaped strategy, changed flight paths, grounded missions, silenced radios. The Luftwaffe, once bold and aggressive, was now reduced to fragments of its former self. Not because its pilots lacked courage, but because the balance of power had shifted beyond repair. What once had been a battle of skill became a confrontation with inevitability. The war in the air was no longer a contest of who had the better aircraft. It became a demonstration of what happened when industrial scale, tactical innovation, and engineering brilliance came together with relentless force. And that force flew with the wings of a Mustang. The aircraft's legacy only deepened after the war. It went on to serve in Korea. It was adopted by more than 50 countries, and even today, surviving Mustangs still fly at air shows, their engines echoing like ghosts from another era. Restored with care, flown with pride, these machines remind us that history does not just sit in books. Sometimes it screams across the sky, but its greatest legacy is not just technical, it is emotional. It is the silence of the enemy when it arrived, the tears of bomber crews when it protected them, the quiet pride in the voice of a veteran who flew it and made it back home. It is the ripple effect of what happens when one design, born of necessity, refined by collaboration, and proven by fire, becomes a turning point in the most devastating war mankind has ever known. There are moments in history when technology transcends its purpose, when it becomes memory, myth. The P-51 Mustang was one of those moments. Because it did not just help win a war, it changed what it meant to fight one. It taught us that victory in the air is not always about dominance. Sometimes it is about persistence, about reach, about silence, and about the echo that silence leaves behind. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, thousands of Mustangs had flown thousands of missions. The Luftwaffe, once proud and feared, had been reduced to remnants, not just by bombs or bullets, but by a shift in the air itself. The sky no longer belonged to Germany. It belonged to the sound that came with silver wings. It belonged to the hum of the Merlin. It belonged to the machine that turned fear into silence and silence into surrender. The Mustang did not ask for recognition. It earned it. And for those who remember the war not through headlines, but through the smell of oil, the vibration of the cockpit, the sound of tracers, and the sharp tone of a radio suddenly going quiet, the Mustang is not just a plane, it is a feeling. Thank you for flying through this journey with us, for listening, for remembering, and for keeping these stories alive. If this story moved you, if it gave you a deeper understanding of what those skies once held, leave a comment below and let your voice become part of the memory. Your thoughts matter here, and they help carry these stories forward. Make sure you are subscribed so you never miss what comes next. Click on the next video now appearing on your screen and continue discovering the forgotten echoes of the past. One mission, one story, one heartbeat at a time.